Welcome to this podcast. Today we are going to discuss practical ways in which we can see the playing out of the self-care system that is constellated in the child's unconscious in the playroom. So in this podcast, Psychic Steps, we explore certain aspects as it relates to the Jungian theory in child therapy. I also want to remind you that if you are interested in more training, you can visit my website at www.playtherapytraining.net for more opportunities of training in this regard. So let's talk today about how do we see if a child has been traumatized at a young age merely by a primary caregiver and the self-care system has developed in the child's unconscious? How would that play out in the playroom? In what ways can we see that play out in the playroom? So in a previous podcast, I have discussed the development of the self-care system. And if you are interested, you can listen to that. Today, I want to talk about how we see that practically playing out. So when a child is traumatized at a young age, a self-care system develops in the child's unconscious. And the child's unconscious split into two parts. So one part is a regress part, and that is where there's a younger part of the child that is trapped in the psyche. And one part become a progress part where there is now a part of the child's psyche that enhance and grow up too quickly and function at a much older age than the child is. So the real self, the true self of the child, the essence of the child is protected through the development of the self-care system, the regress and the progress part. Now, when we talk about regression, what is that and how would that look in terms of a child's behavior? How would that look in the playroom? In terms of a regression, a child's psyche goes back to a previous stage where the child felt safe. And we sometimes see when a child is traumatized that after trauma, like for example when a caregiver dies or when there has been chronic multiple trauma, that children function on a regress part. Now, in terms of the self-care system, there's a part of the child that acts on a regress place. So, for example, a child that has been potty trained can start bedwetting again. A child suddenly wants to drink the bottle again. A child struggles to get weaned off the bottle or the pacifier. A child cannot sleep on their own and they have extreme separation anxiety to go and sleep on their own, or even when they are dropped off at school. In the playroom, we will see that a child that is older than 18 months, so let's say, for example, the child is 4, 5, or 6 years old, very much a lot of the child's play, for example, in the sand tray, will still be around mothers with babies. This is called the mother-child unity and normally applicable for a child at the age of 0 to 18 months. But when there's regression, you see lots and lots of mother-child unities in the play of the child, specifically in the sand tray. It might also happen that the child play that out, for example, in the dollhouse. So lots of mother-child unities, or the child might even go back to pre-birth state where there are the child use all your nests with eggs, lots of nests with eggs with mothers that sit with mother birds, for example, that sit on the eggs or next to the eggs. So it might go back to that, or a child, for example, might take a nest with eggs and put that in a cave. The cave, a representation often of the womb. So regression in terms of the outer life, as I've described, that the child is not functioning emotionally on age level and suddenly it goes back to a younger age, and there's a resistance of that younger part, that regressed part, to grow up and to function at age level. Another sign is also a child that still make use of baby language. And it's interesting that it's not all the time, because sometimes the regressed part is activated and sometimes the progressed part is activated. But in certain situations, at home, at school, or when the child feels unsure, you might hear the baby language. In children's drawings, that will play out where a child that is in terms of chronological age, able to make drawings of full human figures, go back and only draw the tadpole, which is just the head and the arms sometimes coming from the head and the legs as well. So there's no torso and no tummy. And that is often also not consistent. So the child, today, the child of 6 or 7 years old can draw a full body, a human body, with all the, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the hair, the arms, the legs, the tummy and feet and hands and so. And then another day, when the child do a drawing, the child will only make tadpole figures. We can also see some regression in terms of a child of a little bit older than 4, so let's say 6, 7 and older, that when they make a painting in the playroom, they make an egg-shaped drawing, which is an egg with an egg shape with a nucleus in it, or scribbling, or they make there's a sign of boundlessness where they just make marks on the paper, and often it goes off the paper. Now that boundlessness is a sign of the early childhood, before birth, the early conception, the feeding of the fetus just in conception, where there's boundlessness and lots of space to move in the womb. So that is also another way in which we can see the regression in the play. Another way is that where a child should have been at an age to play symbolic imaginary play, where the child's play is back to a younger age. Then, in terms of the progressive part, that is the part of the psyche that progress to an older age than the child is, and the progress part divides into two voices, namely a protective voice and a persecutory voice. The protective voice will be that part that tell the child not to trust the therapist, not to trust other people, or maybe a substitute caregiver, because you're going to get hurt again. So that is also the inner voice that make a child in the therapy room to break contact. A traumatized child might make a sad story, and you can see chaos and you can see abuse in the same story, or entrapment or barricade, or literal abuse for a baby that's hidden, that's hit with a belt or thrown out of the 3rd floor of a dollhouse. But when you try to discuss that on reality level with the child, so this was the child's projection, but if the therapist tried to talk on, can it be that in your life this also happened, the child will break contact and refuse to talk about that and walk away, and even say to you, I now want to do this or that, I want to play a board game or so. So the therapist, in a sense, have to work, is almost working in opposition with the inner protective voice that tells the child that I will make sure that you don't get hurt again, but don't tell anyone about what happened. The other part of the progressive part is the inner persecutory voice, and the inner persecutory voice is the voice that tell the child everything is your fault. That is often projected in the playroom through a negative mother figure in terms of a witch. I've seen that many, many times, that a witch figure that is entrapping a little child, a victim, a small animal, or I have a Rapunzel castle in my playroom. Now, the story of Rapunzel is a beautiful illustration of the self-care system with the regress and the progress part. And if you have seen the movie Tangled, you will be reminded of how Rapunzel asked the witch in the story, "Can I please leave the tower?" And she want to play outside and she want to see the lights. And then the witch gets furious, and you see the split of the progressive and the regressive part, where the witch tell her, "You will never make it in the outside world. No, stay here. Don't grow up. Don't discover. Don't explore. Don't be creative. Don't be in touch with your spiritual aspect. No, stay here. That's the only place that is safe." And the persecutory voice, where the witch get angry and tell her, "Don't ever ask me to leave the tower." The persecutory voice is also the part that lead to the intense self-persecution, intense self-blaming voice, often seen in a bit older kids and teenagers as having extreme guilt feelings about what happened to them in their life, having a guilt complex where like it doesn't matter what happens in their life, even if a parent is abusing the child carries the guilt of, "I must have done something to cause this." And the guilt, the primary guilt and the guilt complex that is so easily triggered, even if a traumatized child learn to become stronger and stand up for themselves and being a bit self-assertive, or just ask for a need to be satisfied, you will hear in the consultation room that they tell you about the extreme immense guilt that they feel when they ask for a need to be met. And the reason for that guilt is the inner persecutory voice of that witch inside. Now, that negative mother complex inside that fluctuates between, "I'm trying to take care of you and protect you so that you don't get hurt," and everything is your fault and you're bad, and actually it will be better if you regress to a point of dying. And that is where the persecutors sometimes try to arrange suicidality in a traumatized child. Now, what I've seen played out in terms of the progress and regress part in the playroom is, for example, a baby that is trapped in a house, and there's a very angry, vicious figure, sometimes an archetypal figure, sometimes a witch, sometimes an aggressive animal like a lion that's walking around and around the house to make sure that the baby can't leave the house. What also play out, what is very interesting, is that the baby is always unmothered. There is no positive mother figure in that house taking care of the baby. And that's the regress part that's trapped into that regress state and being unmothered. So you might also see a place of babies totally left alone and abandoned, or parents or a negative parent figure leaving the children and leaving them all alone without food. So that abandonment, entrapment, threat, themes of threat that play out in the child's play. I've also seen a baby figure that, for example, is trapped in a house, and when the baby wants to get out of the house, there are a lot of witches. All my witches that I have in my miniatures are placed, for example, in different spaces in the sand tray to make sure that it doesn't matter at what place the baby tried to leave, there will be a witch that catch the baby. So what is also interesting is we can also see the self-care system playing out in the dreams of traumatized children. So the regress part of the personality is usually represented as a vulnerable, young, innocent, often a female child or an animal, a little baby animal that remains shamefully hidden. So sometimes it is a special animal. It might be also a favorite pet or a kitten or a puppy or a bird. I also see that play out in the sand tray work, where that animal is trapped into a cage. For example, when a child don't use the Rapunzel tower, it's a cage or something else that is causing the entrapment. Okay, and then the part of the personality, the progress part in dreams, is often represented by a powerful great being that often is a negative figure that I've seen, like a witch, that protects and persecutes, and might sometimes take turns between the persecution and the protection of the vulnerable part, which might be an animal, a baby animal, or a vulnerable baby, or like I said, a pet that is kept in one or other way imprisoned. You might also see, for example, where a child make a drawing and there's a person or little baby trapped in the trunk of a tree. Or a child might, for example, dream that at the preschool, for example, that the young part is trapped there and cannot get out, and there's definite fences and barricade as the indicating the boundaries or the limits of the self-care system, now being trapped there. And then inside that entrapment, you will always see playing out the vulnerable young innocent part that is hidden and trapped, and then the persecutor protector that prevents that part from getting out, getting positive mothering and growing up. So there's a definite theme of threat and entrapment, and the negative mother energy that is combined between I want to protect you, you will not survive in the outside world, versus this is your fault. So a lot of guilt in terms of these kids and how they feel also. Then what we also see is, although the outside trauma happened and the self-care system form, something that often split out is that there's a constant re-traumatization. So the traumatized psyche is self-re-traumatizing. So the trauma doesn't end with the initial outer violence, but it continues to I almost want to say destabilizes the inner world of the trauma victim and the child. The dreams that these kids get, the nightmares that they get, is often by being haunted by the persecutory inner figures. So children sometimes even have resistance to talk about a dream or make a drawing of the dream, but I've seen it played out if I ask them to build a dream in the sand tray, I've seen this re-traumatization taking place between what the progress part and often this negative figure do to the little baby figure. So that's the one thing that happened. And then the second thing that often happen is that the victim of the initial psychological trauma continually finds themselves in life situations where they are re-traumatized. So when we look at all the development of the child, that especially a child with post-traumatic stress disorder, where all the development of the child that gets harm as a result of the trauma, then what happens is often these kids don't have proper ego development, so they don't have good differentiation between this is who I am and this is who I am not. So what happens is that because of that, there's often blurred boundaries, there's often enmeshment, and abusers, specifically sexual abusers, use that as a way to hover in the victim and to exploit them again and again. Now, the self-care system, if we talk a bit about the self-care system and the attachment theory, the self-care system can be seen as a set of internal working models in the child that reflects the relationship patterns, the outside patterns that then have been internalized, the early outside patterns. And this provide in turn expectations about what I can expect in an outer relationship that influence how also the child interprets their interpersonal world. So the self-care system develops out of the early childhood trauma, as I've said, but often this trauma relates to trauma that happened with early attachment figures that also very negatively affect the development of the child's secure attachment. The split in the psyche is then a way to survive these unbearable traumatic early experiences. It has an interpersonal function, the self-care system. It helps the child to regulate emotions and to avoid often re-traumatization by inhibiting self-expression. So a child will also often be very meek and don't speak up and don't develop in terms of their own personality and their own gifts and talents. There's also element that regulate attachment, and often children who are traumatized develop an avoidant attachment where they learn from very young not to trust the caregiver, to take care of themselves, that caregivers are not available, and that they have to create a certain emotional distance, sometimes also physical distance from the caregiver in order to be safe. So the frame of mind of the child that develops the avoidant attachment is, I will do it all by myself. So dependency, vulnerability, and weakness need to be denied by all costs, because that can make you prone to be hurt again. The self-care system is then the way in which dissociation of the unbearable experiences, often in early childhood, is kept into place. And shame-ridden states, that shame of I'm bad, I'm despicable, everything is my fault, are controlled through the dissociation. In severe cases, there's also switching sequences towards dissociative identity disorder and being totally fragmented or compartmentalized into different self states in the unconscious. So it separates sensation, feelings, and images, which make it often hard to create a coherent trauma narrative in therapy. And for children who had pre-verbal trauma under the age of 3 years old, it is impossible to tell a story in terms of words in the therapy room, because the unbearable experiences happened before there was language development. So the self-care system keeps the innocent pre-traumatic soul of the child, the true self of the child, out of suffering and prevents that violation. And that is absolutely a way to keep that true self of the trauma victim alive. So not all trauma can even be remembered as a coherent story, and often in childhood it occurred too early to be ever recovered as explicit memory, although the child can still play out what has happened. The right brain of the child, where the trauma is stored, can still project in the Sandra, in a story, in the dollhouse, and so what has happened. So often the trauma happened before ego formation in 2.5 to 3 years old. So the child's ego is also, the conscious part of the personality is also unformed or immature. And often in early childhood, the child's ego is also very deeply identified with the abusers in the child's close environment, who the child is dependent on. So what I also have seen a lot in the playroom is how children carry a guilt complex, traumatized children, where they will, for example, take a baby figure and start hitting the baby figure with a belt and saying, bad baby, bad baby. Or a child that will take a little baby, for example, and bury it under the sand and voice and say, this is an evil baby. Or trap the baby into a cage, which is the entrapment of the self-care system, but add on to the entrapment and the regress part that is entrapped without a positive mother, caring, nourishing figure, you also get the words where they persecute the baby. So you get that a child client in the playroom will speak that words of the inner persecutor towards a baby figure, and act aggressively towards the regressive part. So in early trauma, the right hemisphere of the brain, which is most active in the first 18 months of the child's life, is more affected. And this has far-reaching consequences for especially the development of the child's, the emotional regulation of the child. So often the actions of the early traumatized child stem from the actions and emotional regulation is quite autonomic and innate reflexes. And when the young child was traumatized, these speedy responses were absolutely crucial for survival, more so for a child to grow up in an unsafe, unpredictable environment. And this explains why infants tend to swing back and forth between positive and negative emotional states. So, What I want to end off with today is just to say that we can see in a child's play, we can see in a child's in dreams that children have. And that they play out of, that they tell. We can see in projective art activities like drawings of painting of children, the projection of the self-care system, and the entrapment of the true soul inside of that. But in the same way, the play can also help to reintegrate the split in the unconscious of the child and the self-care system. The young part, the baby part, can access a part in the psyche that can nourish and reparent that part. And often you, as a therapist in the playroom, or the figure that the child will transfer their need for a positive mother figure, even if you're a male therapist, and that can bring the constellation of a positive mother complex that can start to take the role of nurturing the trapped regress part that is unnurtured. When we see behavior in terms of the progress part, where the child often acts, part of the child acts at an age much older than the child is, taking parental responsibilities at home, being a parentified child, and often a part of the child acts and talks and thinks about things that is way older than a child of that age. And you can just imagine how that progress part also lead to a traumatized child feeling like an outsider and a misfit because of being exposed to trauma and experiences that I almost want to say squashed the early childhood naivety and innocence of that part. So often that progress part is a part that also don't feel that they fit in the peer group because of these experiences of life-threatening situations, often continuous experience of extreme unpredictability and unsafety in the home environment. So there are ways in therapy that we need to help that part also to come back to age level. But the first thing is that we need to, as a therapist, our voice of acceptance and unconditional acceptance of the child, empathy, coherence, attunement to the child, and creating resonance is necessary for the child to start trusting our voice and our presence more than the voice of the inner persecutor and the inner protector. I want to end off just to say that when you work in the playroom with traumatized children, look out for the projection of the self-care system and know that these kids normally need a much longer term of therapy in order to try to reintegrate that split. And they might also need a different series of therapy at different ages for that to be addressed on the developmental level of the child at a specific time.